Hi, and welcome to Q Talk. My name is Reggie Gossett, and Q Talk is a program of Queers for Economic Justice, QEJ for short. QEJ is a not-for-profit organization addressing issues of poverty, class, welfare, homelessness, the adult side of the NYC shelter system, immigration, and much more in the context of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender nonconforming communities. QEJ has a shelter support group, the Immigration Project, the Welfare Project, the Shelter Project, and this show, Q Talk, which will be taped and aired, hopefully, each month, highlighting different concerns of the LGBT community. My guest today is Sangeeta Budiraja of the Ms. Foundation and the Immigrants' Rights Policy Analyst of QEJ. Welcome, Sangeeta.
Thanks, Reggie.
My first question is, what's the HIV immigration ban?
Well, the HIV immigration ban has been in effect for over 20 years now. I want to talk a little bit about the history of the ban first before I tell you exactly what it is. So until the 1990s, homosexuality itself was a grounds for inadmissibility to the U.S. That was in effect until, I think, about 1991. It was seen as an act of sexual deviance, and as such, homosexual people were not allowed to immigrate to the U.S. Because of the conflation of homosexuality and HIV, this common assumption that it's only homosexuals, and I'm using that term loosely and using it in government analysis. I'm not saying that's the word that we as progressives use.
Right.
So because it was seen that homosexuals were the vectors of the disease, I think is how this ban sort of came into effect. So it's kind of homophobic in its inception. So the ban was enacted initially. It was under the purview of the Department of Health and Human Services, and it was an administrative act. And in 1993, Congress made it a statutory ban and enshrined it in the Immigration and Nationality Act. So I wanted to actually read the language from the ban. So what it says is, any alien who is determined to have a communicable disease of public health significance, which shall include infection with the etiological agent for acquired immune deficiency syndrome, is ineligible to receive a visa or to be admitted to the U.S. And I think it's really important that we talk about this issue because I don't think it's something that the general public really even knows exists. So what this ban does is it effectively bars HIV-positive people from coming to the U.S., which, I mean, it's ludicrous, really, to think about it in that way. It's an entry bar, and it's also a travel bar, which means that you cannot travel to the U.S. if you are known to be HIV positive, and you can't immigrate into the U.S. And if you're in the U.S. and you're an undocumented immigrant and you're found to be HIV positive, there are many, you would either be deported or detained. Right. And it also prevents you from gaining any other kind of legal status. So it has it's a really dangerous policy. There's been a lot of movement around it, which we'll talk about later. But like I said, it's been in effect for 20 years.
Wow. So what are the consequences of the HIV immigration ban?
Well, I think one of the things to point out is that it's a legislative act, and so the only way that this ban can be overturned is through a legislative act of Congress. So it's really Congress that we need to be lobbying on this issue.
Okay.
I think there can be a lot of organizing around it. But one of the major arguments that people for the ban make is that it protects the public health and it protects the public coffers. There's this, this idea that HIV is really expensive to treat, and so if we had less HIV positive people in this country, then we would save money, and that it's such a communicable disease. People are still very uncertain and have very little knowledge about prevention, and the point is, I don't think that's true at all. Right. I think that it's not protecting the public health to not have HIV-positive people in this country, clearly, and we know that statistically, and we know that from a number of other sources. So what the consequences that it has is that it actually undermines the public health and drives up the cost of health care. It dissuades travelers from coming to the U.S., and if they are coming to the U.S., they're not going to bring their antiretrovirals because they might get caught on the way in, and then they'll be sent back. It definitely results in the interruption of treatment regimes if people are coming in without their meds. And that drives up the risk of drug resistance. It forces non-green card holders underground. I mean, if you're here, you're living in a climate of fear already.
Right.
If you're HIV positive, you're going to go underground, which means you're not going to seek treatment. You may not get tested if you have engaged in risky, quote unquote, behavior. Right. You may not seek preventative care, and you may not end up even seeking treatment at all or going to the emergency room until you have full-blown AIDS. Right. And that undermines individual health and public health, and it would ultimately put strain on the public coffers. So I think that argument is faulty in general, and I think that that's one of the avenues that we need to take when we advocate on this issue.
Okay. Well, you mentioned this climate of fear, so I'm wondering, how has immigration issues been impacted post 9/11 in this climate of fear that we're living in today?
I think we're all well aware that there's been a marked erosion of immigrant rights post 9/11. I think pre 9/11 as well. But we know that detention and deportation has been on the rise for years. And even pre 9/11, the 1996 Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, that act actually deported 1.5 million green card holders since 1996 due to minor criminal convictions, even when they had already served time for those convictions. And so there's been, I mean, we know about the Patriot Act, we know about invasions of privacy, we know about detentions, deportations, raids. I mean, immigrant rights are just being eroded all over this country, and it's a big debate, obviously, at the moment, given the current elections. But I think what it's done is it's really created a climate of fear for immigrants, as I said earlier. And this bar played off with general immigration policies is just an added thing that adds to this climate of fear and drives people underground and creates secrecy, and it has really dangerous effects.
Right. Okay. So you work for Queers for Economic Justice. So I'm wondering, why is immigration also a queer issue? What intersections between immigration and queer?
I'm glad you asked that, because I think that this issue itself points out a lot of intersectional analyses, which I think are important to talk about. First of all, we can't ever say that the LGBT community and the immigrant community is mutually exclusive. Right? There's overlap in every community, and I think whenever we're advocating on an issue, it's really easy to say, this is our issue and this is their issue. But we know for a fact that there are 10 to 14,000 undocumented immigrants in this country. Statistically, that means there are thousands of LGBT undocumented immigrants in this country. And I think from a political analysis standpoint, it's also important to realize that it's often the most marginalized and vulnerable groups that are the first to be targeted. And so I think the policies that are playing out on LGBT people and the policies that are playing out on immigrants are definitely interconnected and are about our departure from the norm. So we recognize that historically, immigrant and LGBT struggles have been rooted in homophobia, and the assumption that, as I said earlier, that LGBT people are the carriers and the vectors of HIV. And we also know that LGBT people and immigrant people have historically been portrayed in this country as the other, and have always been scapegoated. And so I think it's really important when we talk about the intersection of struggles that we actually take on and understand that there are people that overlap in those communities, and that it's really important that we talk about immigration as a queer issue.
Right. So you mentioned struggle. I'm wondering what are the biggest sites of resistance, and where is the most exciting work being done around these intersecting issues?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, it's a really intersectional issue. So this ban touches on a number of different communities, and there have been a lot of communities that have gotten involved in the advocacy around it. And it's both legislative advocacy, and it's also community advocacy and organizing. In New York City specifically, there's been a number of coalitions of human rights groups, immigrant justice groups, economic justice groups, public health groups, and queer rights groups. And I think, that's really the heart of this issue, right, is that it really does affect so many different people. The act in itself, the ban, is a clear violation of human rights. We're one of the only countries that still has this in effect. It affects the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the U.S. hasn't really signed on to. But it affects freedom from discrimination, it affects freedom of movement, the right to privacy, which are really huge issues in the human rights community. And, it's just a clear violation of human rights. Obviously, it's an immigrant justice issue. It needs to be tackled on a larger scale of immigrant justice issues. And it's an LGBT issue and a direct service issue. I mean, we know of a number of organizations, Gay Men's Health Crisis, African Services Committee, they're all doing work with HIV-positive LGBT people in this country who are facing the consequences of this ban. There have been a few coalitions that have been formed, one of which I'd like to talk about specifically.
Definitely.
Which is the Lift the Bar Coalition, which was started a few years ago. And it's a coalition of national immigrant rights groups, human rights groups, LGBT groups, some mainstream LGBT groups, some progressive LGBT groups. And there's a number of principles that are involved. And I think one of the most important principles of Lift the Bar is that it really takes on a larger immigrant justice perspective.
Right.
So it's not just about this very small issue, but really looks at it in the context of this erosion of immigrant rights and homophobia.
Right.
And so I think it's really important that a lot of groups have signed on to the points of unity for Lift the Bar. And I think we can provide more information at some point if people want to be involved in it and know more about it. But I think the process going forward with Lift the Bar is really to think about how do we get as many organizations nationally signed on to opposing this bar, and from different communities. So that's one of the organizations. And then just to say that larger immigrant justice organizations have also picked up the importance of this bar. And I think one of the criticisms has always been that immigrant rights and immigrant rights policy has been focused on racial and economic issues, and that it's really important to insert the queer perspective in that. And so, and it's also come up a lot in, I think queer issues have also come up in other immigration policies in terms of the driver's license issues that have been happening in New York City lately that are tied to Homeland Security. So I think there's been a lot of movement, coalition movement, which has been really wonderful to see. Immigrant Communities in Action is another pretty much New York City-based coalition that started in 1995 in response to some of the driver's license policies that came out. And they have also taken this issue up as well and have signed on to, I believe they're a member of Lift the Bar. I'm not positive on that, so don't quote me on that one. And then the National Network of Immigrant and Refugee Rights has also talked about this issue quite a bit. And so I think really the most important thing is to get the issue out on the table so that people know that it exists. I don't think that that's common knowledge.
Right.
And, you know, it's hard to talk about the nitty-gritty details of the consequences, and I think the larger ones that we talked about earlier are really important. But just even simply, if the U.S. can't hold an HIV or AIDS conference in the U.S. because the people that we would want at that table to discuss policy concerns wouldn't be able to come.
Right.
There are a lot of other organizations as well that are talking about people not being able to sponsor their binational couple sponsorship. So there are many immigrant rights issues that touch on queer issues as well, and so I think it's important to talk about it in that way.
So what has been the most useful tool in order to show that these are intersecting issues?
I think the coalition work is really the most important thing, to understand that we're not doing single issue organizing, and that for the human rights community to come out and speak out about the HIV immigration ban means that it's not a queer issue specifically, or for the immigrant justice organizations to say, hey, we really need to do something about this, is really powerful. And I think that sends a message to Congress. And so actually one of the things that we're in the process of doing is getting a sign-on letter together, which sort of lays out the history of the bar, what the consequences are, and what should be done, and what we're calling on Congress to do. And I think particularly in this moment where we're having an election, I think it's really important to ask our candidates, do you know about this? What are your plans around this? What is your take on human rights? I think there's been very little talk about the U.S. and its human rights policies. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of work that can be done around this. And, you know, sometimes we have lots of conversations in Lift the Bar about whether or not it's going to be a full repeal of the ban in its entirety, or if it's going to be a more incremental approach. So one of the things that's been happening lately is there have been 2 bills that have been put out that sort of lessen the effect of the bar, but don't repeal it completely. Both Senator Lee and Senator Kerry have put out bills somewhat opposing the bar, mainly in terms of travel, not necessarily in terms of immigration.
Okay.
So there's been a lot of work that's been done specifically on that, and we've put in comments to it and all of that kind of stuff. But I think as a coalition and as we talk about the bar, it's really important to ask for what we want bigger picture.
Right.
And that bigger picture ask is the ban shouldn't exist in the first place.
Right.
And so I think there will be a process to getting rid of it. But I do think it's important to really put it out there that the only just solution is for it to be eradicated.
So as it is an election year, are there particular candidates the coalition's excited about, thinks that...
We haven't gotten to that point, actually, yet.
Okay.
I think it's really important for us all to be checking their websites and really looking through who their advisors are as well and see what their stances have been on various issues. Like I said, it touches on so many issues, and immigration is obviously one of the issues that everybody's talking about.
Definitely.
Though I actually haven't heard anyone talk about the ban specifically.
Okay.
So I wonder, it would be interesting to see how that evolves as you know, people's platforms become more clear.
Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering also, so we know about the HIV immigration ban. Are there other issues that are facing queer and trans immigrant communities?
Absolutely. I think, you know, there are also waivers that are available to the bar, and they're very difficult to attain.
Mm-hmm.
But as we know, a lot of LGBT people come to this country to apply for political asylum based on sexual orientation. And so for those people particularly, just healing from their past and whatever you know, persecution they faced in their countries of origin is really difficult. It creates a lot of isolation. Legal fees and application fees to go through that process are really high. And one of the things that a lot of people don't know is when you come to this country and you want to apply for asylum, you have to do so within 1 year.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's you can't do it anymore. There's a bar on it. And so, like I said before, when people get here, they're often very isolated, and so they don't know about that ban. They haven't been connected to communities in that way.
Right.
And so they lose their opportunity to even apply for asylum. I think a lot of times queer immigrants are caught between their countries, their communities of origin, and the LGBT community here. They often face, obviously, as we know, sexism, racism in the mainstream LGBT community, and homophobia from their countries of origin. And so it's a really difficult situation, I think, to be in, and one that requires a lot of sensitivity and training to direct service providers and to the LGBT community generally to really provide support in a way that takes all of those issues into account. One of the major issues that's facing the trans community is identity documents. And we all know there's been the Real ID Act and this emphasis on everyone having very specific forms of ID that matches, and it's very difficult to change those documents. So many trans people have some documents that indicate one gender and other documents that indicate another. To change them is really difficult. And you know, there's this 6-point criteria for obtaining identification, and so it's really difficult to get all of those identity documents to match. Aside from transphobia, that's all over every administrative agency that's providing these documents. I think previously a trans person could change their gender identity on their driver's license by supplying a letter from a doctor. That is no longer, since the DMV and Homeland Security are now pretty linked together. They can't actually, trans people can't change their gender with that letter anymore, and would have to prove surgery in order to change those documents. And we all know the economic impact that has on the trans community. And I mean, that's definitely an economic justice issue that we should be talking about, and a choice issue for that matter. So that's definitely one other issue. And then, like I mentioned before, sponsoring immigrant partners for immigration to the U.S. Is another issue. Obviously, if you're a binational couple, we don't have rights to marriage. I don't really want to go down that road too far, but it's definitely an issue. Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned a couple of issues that are intersecting. I wonder if you could speak a little more about what are other points of intersection between immigrant communities, queer communities, and larger issues that are going on right now that you're seeing through your work?
I think one of the most important things is that we really talk about policy. And I think there's been, we've been really fortunate to have a lot of organizations that are doing direct service work, which I think is really necessary. But I think that now we need to start shifting into more policy debates and really thinking about what are the strategies to overturn a lot of these homophobic, racist, violative of human rights policies that we have currently. And I think coalition work is also really important as a strategy, long term. And really the need for all of us to do as much training and education as we possibly can. And I know that there's been a lot of community organizing that's been happening around every issue that we've talked about. But I think one of the most important things is that we start training INS officers and we start training other administrative agencies, people that work at the DMV, and really putting energy into drawing sensitivity around these issues, having people understand that they're connected, having people understand that people are being traumatized throughout every process, whether it's in the court, whether it's at the DMV, whether it's at INS, whether it's at the border. So many, it's all over the place. And I think the way that we're going to start changing some of that stuff is really getting at cultural change and training folks that are responsible for carrying out these policies.
Why do you think it's not public knowledge that the HIV ban exists?
Well, one of the things, as I read earlier, the language, but I didn't say earlier that it's actually Section 212A1AI of the Immigration and Nationality Act. So it's this tiny little piece of legislation that I think if you weren't aware of it, you wouldn't be looking for it necessarily. And I think the other thing is that it becomes public knowledge when it affects people's lives. So if you have some kind of direct experience, if you're in direct service work, or if you're in policy advocacy and you're trying to sponsor someone to come speak about something and you realize, oh, I can't do that because they actually aren't allowed to come into the country. So I think the way that it starts becoming public knowledge is when we continue to talk about it. But like I said, you wouldn't find it because it's pretty tiny, and it's definitely not a priority issue in a lot of the policy that's being talked about in terms of immigration. Definitely. So I think the major focus on advocacy should be really raising public consciousness around it.
Definitely. So I'm wondering if we can close with you sharing with us some of the points of the Lift the Bar Coalition.
Yeah, I would love to do that.
Great,
and I think it's important to read these specifically because it ties together a lot of things that we ended up talking about, which is that this is not a single issue for the queer community. It's not an issue specifically for the immigration community. It's a large issue that touches on many different issues, and I think that these points of unity really touch on a lot of them. So I'm just going to read them, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. So the Lift the Bar Coalition demands genuine legalization and opportunities to adjust status for all undocumented immigrants. We demand the repeal of the HIV immigration ban. We oppose the heightened policing and criminalization of immigrant communities, including increased militarization of the border, the construction of any wall around the U.S.-Mexico border, or the use of city and state government agencies to enforce federal immigration law. We impose indefinite and mandatory detention of non-citizens, as well as the mass incarceration of people of color communities in the U.S. and more broadly. And we envision a society that ensures the safety and self-determination of all people, regardless of national origin, race, gender, or sexuality. We demand the strengthening of labor laws and protections for all workers, native and foreign-born, and oppose the guest worker proposals, which would continue the exploitation of many low-wage workers. We oppose penalties imposed on service providers and family members of undocumented immigrants. We oppose the Real ID Act, which I think is huge. We demand the elimination of high income requirements for immigrant sponsors, and we support the the Uniting Families Act, which allows LGBT citizens and green card holders to sponsor their partners for citizenship.
Okay. Well, thank you, Sangeeta, and I want to thank
Thank
you for
you.
being on Q Talk, and I want to
Thank
thank MNN and DCTV for hosting Q Talk as well.